Okay, so this talk is on maritime operational technology and supply chain security. I'm Brian Satira. Slide. So, also known as Readout. You can follow me at Readout with a 3 on Twitter. I'm pretty sure most people attending today, I know there's a good chance you're familiar with I Am the Cavalry, but in case you're not, so I'm a member of I Am the Cavalry. It's an grassroots volunteer organization of researchers committed to promoting cybersecurity where it intersects safety of life issues and critical infrastructure. I am also founder of Hack the Sea, which is the Maritime hacking village at the DEF CON Hacker Conference. And so we will, in fact, be in Las Vegas this August, as well as remote and online. I also run Readout Research, which is my cybersecurity firm focused on operational technology and industrial control system security. And I'm also a contributor at HelpNet Security. So if you want more of my writing and or ideas and thoughts and opinions on, in particular, maritime security, you can follow me at HelpNet. So what's at stake? So the reason to care about this talk is, of course, that the maritime sector underpins the supply chain. So not just a supply chain, but globally, our global economy, the U.S. economy, the supply chain. So roughly 90% of world trade. It's about 11 billion tons of stuff being moved around every year. Many of us found out over the past year in 2020, to put that into more personal perspective, we found out how fragile that supply chain can be. So that includes $2.6 billion worth of toilet paper that the United States imports every year. We are, fun fact, the world's largest importer of toilet paper. So, but maritime touches on as a sector, roughly 25% or a quarter of U.S. GDP. So that's what's at stake. Obviously, economic aspect and safety of life aspects. So, in terms of the threat slide, please. So we should be on the threat landscape.
Yep. That's right.
So in terms of the threat landscape, while some of us have been involved with this for a number of years, I think the public awareness really began to build in 2017 with the Maersk NotPetya attacks. So, Maersk is one of the world's largest, not just shipping companies, but logistics companies, and a huge part of that maritime supply chain. They were crippled for over a week. Very lucky that they were able to recover. A combination of luck and some good fortune in their planning, they were able to recover from that incident. But they lost hundreds of millions of dollars, and things ground to a halt around the world. And the scary thing is that they were not even the target of the attacks. They were collateral damage accidentally from attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure with the NotPetya malware. And we've seen this now repeated with several of the other really large shipping companies. China Ocean Shipping Company in 2018, CMA CGM, which is a French company, in 2020. It's even affected the International Maritime Organization, which in 2020 suffered a breach. And it's not just the traditional enterprise environment in these organizations, the typical IT. We're talking about the OT, the operational technology. And so, the Coast Guard in 2019, and this was kind of unprecedented, for the first time issued marine safety bulletins regarding specific and credible threats to vessels at sea, to commercial vessels, threats from malware and phishing attacks, and actually had to respond to a vessel requesting assistance due to malware disrupting their systems. So that's kind of the environment and the threat landscape. And so the takeaway here for the rest of the talk is to really think about these ships, if you don't already, to think about them as operational technology, or OT. Slide, please. So these vessels are highly automated. If you see, an ultra large container vessel or a large oil tanker or liquid natural gas carrier, we're talking about vessels that are the size of an aircraft carrier, but they only have the crew, of a yacht. They have 10 to 12 people. And really, technology is reaching a point where that crew is somewhat there for legal and insurance reasons more than them really running the ship. These are highly automated. Basically, all systems on the ship now are computerized and networked, from navigation and safety systems to propulsion and power, what the Navy calls HM&E, hull mechanical, electrical, to the cargo management. If you have a vessel, large, let's say oil tanker or container vessel, middle of the Indian Ocean, on its way to Singapore, there is a connection by satellite, most likely, to the internet, and there's someone shoreside, probably a number of people shoreside, including third-party vendors, for example, monitoring sensor data for wear on parts on the engine and pushing firmware updates to the computer that runs the engine. The engines on these ships, it's called common rail diesel. They're entirely computerized. That's the type of environment we're talking about. So the attack surface, if we're looking at this from the perspective of an attacker, is pretty substantial. Next slide. So in terms of where we're at with governance and how organizations and governments are looking to address this risk, this source of risk in supply chain, in 2017, the UN's IMO did issue a first ever resolution outlining and follow on circular outlining guidelines for cyber risk management. They essentially left it up to member organizations to fill in the blanks. So there are two categories of those types of organizations broadly. One are true members, which are nation states. The other are NGOs, who typically have like an observer status. Those NGOs, though, are often the organizations that really govern a lot of the maritime sector. Example is BIMCO, so Baltic International Maritime Council. They, along their consortium of some of the largest, and an umbrella organization, some of the largest ship owners and shipping agents and related organizations. And they, along with a number of these other alphabet soup of different NGOs, issued guidelines on cybersecurity aboard ships. The real bottom line with all of these, though, even though there's several dozen sets of these guidelines that have been issued by different organizations, is that for the most part, number one, they're not laws, they're not regulations, they're guidelines, so they're suggestions. And secondly, they tend to be broad statements of principle at best, so they aren't standards. So they don't provide measurable, specific criteria for how to go about doing this, how to go about assessing and managing, for example, cyber risk within maritime operational technology. Two exceptions to that I will note. The closest thing to actual law or regulation that you'll probably find in the maritime sector internationally is the U.S. Coast Guard, which in 2020 issued a first ever set of guidelines as part of what they call an NVIC, Navigation and Vessel Inspection Circular, where they essentially leveraged existing statutory authority to require MITSA, this is regulated port facilities, to perform some type of cyber risk assessment as part of their annual facility plans. That's about as close as anyone's gotten to that type of regulation. So one of the slightly better sets of guidelines, though, issued by an NGO, next slide, that I'll touch on here briefly, because I think it starts us heading in the right direction, is CIRM, which is the Comité International Radio and Maritime. This was an organization founded in Belgium that's a consortium of producers of shipboard IT and OT technology. And in their guidelines, I give them credit where they've recognized this importance of, and they're the only organization that I've seen do this, of building in security as an element of the software development lifecycle and the continuing development of technology. So the idea is you have to bake in security rather than trying to bolt it on later, and also recognizing the importance of transparency and organizations being open to and supporting vulnerability disclosure, even anonymous reporting of vulnerabilities, and then disclosing and disseminating that information to their end customers, and as well as providing a management through end of life of support, patches and updates and information about incidents and threats, all the way through the chain. And so as they put it, through this whole chain of trust that goes from the original OEM, equipment manufacturer, all the way to the end consumer. And that's really the supply chain I want to talk about. If we can go to the next slide, so we've talked about supply chain in the sense that maritime is a part of our economic global supply chain. But what I'm really talking about here is the linchpin of the maritime sector and of maritime OT, and sort of the soft underbelly and real risk is the kind of hidden risk in the supply chain of all this maritime OT. So a case study here, this is Automaskin's Marine Pro. We can go to the next slide. So this was a project I had worked on in my capacity as an independent security researcher. I had done vulnerability analysis and reverse engineering on diesel engine control units being produced by Automaskin, which is a large Norwegian company that really has over 35, 40 years as an established manufacturer of OT in maritime, oil and gas, and defense. Many of our NATO and other allies rely on Automaskin equipment in their navies. And I was issued, several common vulnerability and exposure numbers for different 0 days for vulnerabilities that I discovered. Had gone through the ethical disclosure process of disclosing this stuff to the company, to Norway's national CERT, NorCERT, US DHS, et cetera. The point that I want to emphasize here, though, is to talk about this issue of the kind of hidden supply chain threats, or risk, I should say. Next slide. So I'll drill down on just one of the 0 days. So, I found that the company had left in the firmware that shipped to every customer a backdoor. So there was an embedded SSH, so a secure shell server that was not disclosed in anything to customers. Customers would not have known that it was there unless they did port scans or something. And it had a hard-coded password that was, a weak 6-character, all lowercase password that was easily cracked. So that was one of the vulnerabilities, but wrapped within that, right, along with getting that product, that diesel engine control unit from Automaskin and getting that backdoor, also wrapped then into that were all of the known vulnerabilities for DropBear SSH, which is the server that was included, specifically version 2012-55, which itself had 3 known vulnerabilities. So there's this idea of a hidden and what they call end day exposure. So 0 days are, as of yet undisclosed. End day are known vulnerabilities that have been known for some time. And so the real issue here is a lack of supply chain transparency in maritime OT, which means that you really can't do what all of these guidelines are calling for and saying, well, you need to manage risk and address risk. You can't really begin to do that and assess risk if you don't know what you actually have in your operational technology on your vessel or in your port. Next slide. And the best example I can give of this is what I ran into with this particular product, which is I became aware in working with Automaskin's distributor and others that NOAA, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Commerce Department, had recently refit some vessels they acquired from the U.S. Navy. One of them was the Nancy Brown, and they had Cummins, the diesel engine manufacturer, refit the engines on these ships. And what they didn't know was that this same Automaskin controller that I was reporting on vulnerabilities in and vulnerabilities in the firmware were included in the engine refit that they received. They didn't know this because Cummins rebranded the equipment as Cummins equipment. So even after I did ethical disclosure and NIST and MITRE and DHS and others, publicly listed these vulnerabilities and there were warnings about it, NOAA was completely unaware that they had this equipment that needed to be patched or that there was an issue with it. And these are cell phone photos you're seeing on the slide that the one of the contractors involved with the retrofit actually took of the inside of the engine room, and which I had to send to the chief of security at NOAA and answer his question of, well, how would anyone get access to our engine room? So the point isn't to beat up on NOAA or anyone else. The point is just to explain that, until I happened to have this conversation with NOAA, with officials from NOAA, they were totally unaware of the risk to their fleet. Next slide. So my recommendations. So where can we go from here? As I said, I think if you get into the details of CIRM's, CRM's guidelines, they're a voluntary organization, and not every maritime OT vendor is a member of CIRM. Automaskin is not. There are other companies that are major vendors that are. So one, some of the things that the federal government could do at different levels, from Congress to the executive, would be requiring perhaps either CIRM compliant or member vendors for federal contracts, or at least perhaps instead establishing guidelines along the CIRM principles for maritime OT vendors and requiring vendors for federal contracts, like putting new engines on a ship for NOAA at the Department of Commerce to be compliant. And another thing would be requiring supply chain transparency for maritime OT. So having an ingredients label so that organizations, when they buy a crane for a port in Long Beach or Houston, or they buy an engine for a ship, they actually know what technology they're dealing with. So if there is vulnerability disclosure, they know that they actually have the technology and it needs to be updated and patched or mitigated. And then I think, funding for grants for independent vulnerability research or bug bounty programs sponsored by the relevant government agencies, DHS, CISA, or other organizations. So that is, we can go to the next slide. So that is the presentation. You can follow me on Twitter and at the other locations that are on the slide. And yeah, thanks to all the organizers.